Enjoy a seat at the table and good company, where great conversations and meaningful discussions happen.
Welcome to And Good Company. I'm Sarah Fiedelholtz, a conversationalist. We all know a great dinner party isn't really about the food. It's about the people seated around the table engaging in lively discussions. And Good Company creates a way to capture smart and important conversations as they happen. I am pleased to be in the company of Dr. Jeffrey Webb, a professor of history at Huntington University. You joined the faculty in 1999.
I did.
Great. And welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on your program.
So I wanted to talk to you a little bit first about you and your background, and how did you get interested in history?
I grew up in a kind of environment that had, lots of sort of books around. My parents had the World Book Encyclopedia, and I found myself, this was an age when there were just 3 channels and we lived out in the country, and so you had to kind of get that one channel that would come in, every once in a while. And so I found myself spending a lot of time in the World Book Encyclopedia, just sort of thumbing through that. And then when I started going to through high school, and then I went to college, I started realizing that the study of history provides you with all kinds of insight into human nature, into how things just sort of work in the world. Mm-hmm. And I found it really compelling that you could use the study of history to provide you with some kind of mm-hmm. insight into why things are the way they mm-hmm. are in the present, because everything has a backstory.
Right. How do you think history is viewed today? Do you think it's valued?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that in the United States, there's a real sort of preference for the here and now, and mm-hmm. for planning for the future, mm-hmm. and to a certain extent, maybe buried deep within our DNA as Americans, there's this desire to escape from history, to mm-hmm. leave tradition, to leave right. The past behind, and to continue to innovate and mm-hmm. to continue to sort of move forward. Mm-hmm. So it might not necessarily be as well appreciated within our culture, within right. our society, as it might be in other places. Mm-hmm. But I do see that there's a huge commitment in the United States to creating history museums and to mm-hmm. Sustaining like a print culture that's right. really devoted to historical works. Like if you go to Barnes and Noble, for example, the history section's quite big. If you look at television programs, there's quite an audience for things like Ken Burns documentaries.
Right,
and whatnot.
like the documentaries and stuff. Mm-hmm. But do you think, and relative to the world, America is very young. Mm-hmm. We you don't realize that, but it is. But do you think that we really understand the idea that we need to understand our past so that we can prevent making the same mistakes in the future? Because they say if we don't learn it, we're destined to repeat it again. Do you really think that in a world where everything is so digital and like TikTok, you do a video and it's gone, and there's no the appreciation of the paper record, and even with the idea that now how newspapers are just kept digitally, and so if that company goes out of business, there's no microfiche permanent record. So do you think that impacts and affects how we think about history and the role that it plays?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a sort of impatience. You just sort of describe it as a here and now ethos, and it does take quite a bit of intellectual effort mm-hmm. to sort of go through and sift through the factors, mm-hmm. that sort of led to the onset of this particular situation or this particular right. event, right? And that labor, I think, is something that many of us don't want to make time for. They would rather have the immediacy of the, sort of the gut reaction right. or the instinctual sort of decision, as opposed to sort of sifting through the backstory behind some event mm-hmm. and really sort of comprehend or come to terms with the richer and more complex right. Situation that might be kind of in front of you.
Uh-huh. And as a professor, of history, and based on your work and the courses that you teach in history, law, religion, Civil War, modern America, you spend a lot of time sort of in the weeds and really looking at the context and really putting perspective on it. So, do you think that your students, do you find that there's an appreciation for that and the importance of doing that as a student today, or do they just take it because it's required?
Well, those can both be true at the same
Okay.
time. I think a lot of the courses that I teach are courses that are required in order to get a bachelor's degree. On the other hand,
At a liberal arts college,
at a liberal
which is
arts college.
very important.
I would agree with that. I think on the other hand, I think people are naturally curious, and you're bringing to them lots of things that they might not necessarily have thought of before. But as you say, history does have these resonances with present-day circumstances.
Right.
I would say probably history doesn't repeat itself so much as says it rhymes, right? History rhymes, right? So there's these rhyming patterns, and
What
students.
do you mean by that?
Well, we were talking a little bit this morning in one of my courses about the problems that the Roman Republic experienced
Okay.
in the first century BC, right? So I was trying to encourage my students to sort of think about how some of these political tensions that are playing out within the Republic, and maybe some of the socioeconomic problems that the Roman Republic was experiencing that these senators had to confront. I think that there's some interesting ways in which you can sort of talk about the political tensions within
Right.
the United States today, right, between our two parties.
Sure.
You could talk about the socioeconomic tensions that are coming up that are fueling, like Bernie Sanders' movement, or the kind of racial tensions that are sort of
I think
playing out in the Black Lives Matter movement.
Right.
So I think you can kind of find these interesting rhyming
Right, okay.
things, and then you can go back to the past and sort of work with some of these materials because it's less threatening. You're not challenging people's political views or the way they kind of think about the current situation. You can kind of go back to the past and say, well, let's just use this as a laboratory. We'll kind of think about the Republic, what's happening to the Republic, why did it go this way?
Right.
You know what I mean? And I think you can get this kind of connection with students if they're really thinking about how this could be relevant to their lives.
Well, speaking about the empire, and all the China-Indo Empire, the Roman Empire, they've all fallen. So, do you think that in some ways, America is not always going to be the great world power? It hasn't been. Do you think that we sort of are in the falling of the empire?
No.
No?
It is again very interesting that we're having this discussion now because we were just talking about this with my students because one of the ancient authors who we were consulting, his name was Polybius, he wrote about the Roman Republic at its height, and he actually says very directly that, in the nature of things, there's growth, there's the perfection, he calls it, or the maturity of the thing, and then there's the decline, and he was referring to the Roman Constitution, right? The Roman Constitution grew, it sort of developed, it became, he used the word perfect, right? It reached the height of perfection, but he was also anticipating that at one point it would fall into a state of decay and possibly collapse, and he was...
And it did.
Yeah, he was issuing some warnings, and this was only about 100 years before, Julius Caesar and the whole, collapse of the Republic, right before we get Augustus and the empire.
Right. So, that's why I think that people take certain things for granted. So, but in your research, so you've done, you do a lot of audio media work, which is where you really are, your lectures are available. And so the most recent one that you're doing is with Franklin D. Roosevelt and the American Century. So, and when you look at FDR, what was it why were you interested in him, and in what context were you looking at him in these lectures?
I think the figure of Franklin D. Roosevelt is a really large figure in the 20th century, right? And there's some things about his life, his career, his presidency that have been sort of taken, I think, in contemporary times as a sort of touchstone that we kind of think about, change over time all the way to our present against, right? So this is the sort of beginning of the time when America sort of became great, right? We think of the post-war era, the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, when everything was running white hot, the American economy was burgeoning, we were growing, the interstate highway system, the space program, right?
But we had to get there.
I wanted to go back to ask some questions about the FDR administration, about FDR's leadership of the country during that period, because he pulled the United States through a couple of really important periods, right? The crisis of the Great Depression and then World War II. And you can make the case that America sort of became great partly due to the leadership that Roosevelt gave to the country during these moments in crisis, and then established some some important things about American government and the relationship between Americans and their governing institutions that really cast a very long shadow over the post-war era. So I think, to a certain degree, the kind of Make America Great Again and this kind of idea of returning to a moment of national prestige and prosperity when American influence was felt around the world.
Right.
You want to go back to this time when basically Roosevelt sort of governed the country and then left a legacy for future presidents.
So what was the period of time that he actually governed? What were the years was?
So 32, the election of 32, so on into the mid to late 1930s, and then all the way through to 1945,
right.
When he passed away in office.
And people I don't think that they really realize that before even, we were not prepared for World War I. Like, we didn't have our soldiers or our military or the right equipment, and we really were not at all a country of any strength or magnitude, and certainly even in World War II we really weren't. We didn't have like the sort of the incredible planes and tanks that the Germans had, and so how do you think that that what it is that you think that Roosevelt did to sort of get us to be able to endure and survive the Depression and then make it through the struggles of World War II, and then also then to become this country? What do you think it is about him and what he sort of gave to the country?
It's an interesting question, and you would think just on the surface of it, he would be the kind of guy who wouldn't necessarily present as somebody who could really make these kind of connections to Americans. He's really, really wealthy, comes from a privileged family, New Yorker, right? But he found a way over the course of his career to make connections with people across the social gulf, right, between him and the people who worked on, the estate at Hyde Park, or the Southerners that he was interacting with at Warm Springs when he was in his period of convalescence after his polio incident.
Right.
And I think it's this quality of being able to connect with people and to be able to speak directly to their concerns and their anxieties and their fears. And he really felt he wanted to sort of bring the country together to, fix what was broken in the economy, right, to get recovery going.
Right.
And he really wanted to bring Americans together to confront this grave threat, to American security, the Japanese attacks and the German U-boats and stuff like that. And I think he really profoundly felt himself to be a president for all of Americans, right? And I really feel there was something sort of powerful about that approach. He wanted to essentially maintain his electoral coalition going back to the election of 32.
Right.
And the way to do that is to sort of make this broad, wide-ranging appeal.
Well, you talked about this idea about his temperament, and you say that that's vital for a president. What do you mean by that, and why is it so important?
Yeah, it was said about FDR that, I think this is wrong, but that he had a second-class intellect but a first-class temperament, and that was what really made him politically successful. I actually think he was a pretty smart guy as well, but he possessed this set of character traits that encouraged him to sort of be open and to be sociable. He had a very sort of convivial style. People sort of enjoyed hanging around with him. He enjoyed having other people with him. And he possessed what I think we would now call a really well-developed social intelligence.
Right. Like I'm just thinking EQ, the emotional.
That's right.
Like those what they call the soft skills that intuition and listening and being able to find commonality. But I also think that he also was able to tap into a sense of providing hope, and also to address the fundamental emotion that people had at the time, which was fear. And so I think he also was able to tap into these very raw but important emotions that people were feeling and sort of addressing those. And
yeah, and it was acknowledging the fact that people were anxious and fearful, while also then providing them with a sense of hopeful optimism that things are going to get better, that together, we sort of can cooperate and we can drag ourselves out of the trough of the Depression, or we can pull this mobilization effort together and really confront this threat, this military threat in the Pacific and in Europe. And so I really do think that that's part of his, I guess you'd say, toolkit as president, was this kind of optimism, this sense that these challenges can be overcome, and you can really track that all the way through his life, but especially in the case when he suffered paralysis. He really felt that he was going to recover from that. He would not hear from anybody around him that he was going to be in a wheelchair for the rest of his life.
Well, he also took the great stake that people didn't see him or photographs of him in the wheelchair.
Yeah, he really felt that there was going to be another phase of his career when he would be walking again, and he didn't want this to be a sort of drag on his, his public image, I think. And so this is a reflection, I think, of the person he was. Is this person who was just relentlessly optimistic. Right.
I sort of was curious because do you think in some ways why he was successful in what he was doing is because I sort of thought we sort of got two presidents for the price of one, because we had his wife, Eleanor, who was very involved, and I think she also brought, those softer skills or a different perspective and looking at, how to look at all of the Americans and bring them together. So I just wondered what you thought about that, and if there is, because they say behind every great man is an even greater woman. But do you think that we sort of did have this working together and partnership, and do you think that also was the precursor of what we saw for for first ladies taking on more of a political issues, and sometimes it worked well and sometimes it hasn't going forward? But what do you think about that idea of that we got two presidents?
Well, I would say we had one president, but we had an active collaboration between Eleanor and Franklin, and there's no question that she was, incredibly gifted in all kinds of different ways, but also possessed this real interest and real empathy for the working poor and for racial minorities. These were people that were largely invisible, right? These were people that were not normally paid attention to by politicians in Washington, and she was careful to cast, if you want to kind of describe it this way, sort of cast the president's vision onto this population. And these people really, again, felt that they were being taken seriously, that their concerns were being heard.
And acknowledged.
And partly it was FDR doing it, but I think we can also recognize that Eleanor did an enormous amount of this work on his behalf, especially the fact that he spent a lot of time convalescing. He would be in Georgia, and she would be doing speaking engagements
well, she said in a lot of ways she was his legs when he could, but I just was, I think she also brought a lot to being able for him to do as much as he was able to do. But he also had a lot of flaws and failures, and certainly during World War II, he made some very critical mistakes. And did he ever acknowledge them and sort of, because he really didn't have time in a sense because he died, so there really wasn't the sort of post-mortem when you leave office, and other people had to do it for him, the historians. But do you think that he recognized or realized some of the mistakes he made? And
I don't know much about that. I would say that there were some blindnesses and some things that were it to do over again, he might have wanted to, take a different approach or move in a different direction. Historians have certainly given him a beating on all kinds of things. The left, redlining and these kinds of things. The right, he's a wolf in sheep's clothing, he's a real commie, and we're kind of moving into socialism. So we found plenty to say about him in hindsight, but I think at the time he was a person who was always thinking about the present challenges and then how to overcome those by utilizing the tools of office and utilizing his public appeal over the radio addresses and the other kind of communications, maintaining access with the media and so forth.
So you talk about the idea of moving into this period of modern America and the role he played. When did modern America begin? Was it after World War II, or was it during World War II, or even between where we're, I mean, where is it, and what do you define modern America as?
Yeah, no, this will be a really slippery concept, but it sort of comes from sociology and this kind of idea of modernization, that we're sort of leaving behind, traditional societies and traditional folkways, traditional modes of production, and we're sort of moving into a modern
industrial, right?
Yep. So the Industrial Revolution is a big part of modernization, but also shifting populations from rural regions and small towns, and urbanization is a part of it. I think the expansion of central governments are part of modernization. This has to do with, responding to these technological problems, industrial economic problems produced by industrialization, and also the responding to the problems of the city, which are sort of new problems in the 19th and 20th century. I kind of liked the idea that Franklin's life ran parallel to all these developments, because he was sort of born in the
What, how many?
Yeah, he's sort of born in the sort of Victorian era,
right,
when they're still lighting their homes with, gas lamps,
right,
and everyone's riding around in horses and horse carts and carriages, and over the course of his life, these massive changes, we get the development of consumer society, we get the mass media, we get kind of the characteristic profile of American society as we kind of understand it today. Now we've had the digital revolution,
right,
and our lives are now very different than they were lived in the 1960s or 1950s.
Right, it's like we had the agrarian revolution, the industrial revolution, and now we're in the technological revolution.
Yeah, but this is a guy, again, who would be driven around, in a carriage, and then, his first political campaigns, he's being driven around in a car, and then by the time he's president, he's flying around in an airplane. I mean, just imagine those changes, right? And he's essentially our nation's leader during some of the most important of those changes.
And you also said that what partly interested you in this project of wanting to record and provide lectures to the public, not just for students, is that you believe that it's sort of a catalyst for the current national conversation, although I sort of joked to myself, we're not really having a conversation, but on a national level, but about the presidency and what makes a great president. So how does that, sort of take it from what we learned in history to where we are, and how did we get here in the terms of, because a lot of people, looked at judging other presidents, based on what they did in the great communicator of Reagan, and and then what Clinton sort of modeled after, and what they brought to being a great president. And yet then we got to a period where people were like, well, we don't want anybody who has political experience. We want somebody who doesn't have those skills. So just sort of give me how we got here in terms of how we looked at this great president to not wanting someone who, has anything that recognized as the things that we thought made a great president.
I would say that FDR still sort of operates in the background as everybody's idea of what a great president is, and there's several. He's not the only one, right? And part of it has to do with longevity, right? He was around for a long time, and he left a huge legacy of laws enacted and programs built and expansion of the federal government. He had some serious, impact on the shape and the contours of American government. Yeah, and that again lasted all the way through, probably until you started to get this conservative movement in the 1970s and 1980s that brings us Ronald Reagan.
Right.
But Reagan possessed a lot of the same, attributes of the FDR, right? Again, his ability to connect with people, the folksiness, the ability to communicate. He also had a pretty coherent vision for where he wanted to lead the country.
Right.
I think that distinguishes some of these presidents from other presidents, and I think FDR certainly had a vision.
And they said that Clinton really modeled himself a lot after Reagan in terms of being able to make someone feel that they're the only person in the room, and be the communicator and the folksy type of, and then we had, how do you think the Bushes, how did they do? I mean, what do you think they did in terms of, do you think they had the skills of a great president, and what you would feel sort of embodies, like some of the things from FDR, and then Obama? What do you think? If you just
I think each of these figures from the 90s and on into the 2000s and 2010s are going to have kind of left their mark, you know, in some ways. The Bushes will kind of remember George Herbert Walker Bush for leading the nation when the Cold War began to end and the Soviet Union sort of came apart,
Right.
and we looked to him for leadership, and I think he did provide that. You know, he was the expert, right, in this
Well,
field.
he was the CIA
exactly,
director,
like this
so
was
he
his.
knew that was his, you know, wheelhouse.
So diplomacy and international
Right.
affairs were really his strong suit, and I think we'll probably remember George Bush for, you know, helping the country get through 9/11, the 9/11 experience, and dealing with the terrorist threat to the United States. I think those are things that'll probably last, you know, as kind of presidential legacies.
I sort of joke, and because you're a historian, and I was just saying to someone last night, I was like, I really want to know what in 50 years, what historians are going to say about this period of time in the history of the United States, because it just seems
I'm really jealous. It's a really interesting sandbox to play in, and you know, I kind of have my little sandboxes that I play in, and those are kind of like a long time ago. I was trained to be a colonial Americanist.
Right.
But 50 years from now, wow.
Do you think that do you think that the skills today, with everything that's going on, that we need in our leader, are the same types of skills we need that we had in FDR, or do you think we need to rethink what makes a great president for today and going forward?
Well, culture churns, so I think that will inevitably happen, is that people will sort of alight on different, you know, sort of characteristics. And as you said, you know, there was a period, I suppose not that long ago, when a lot of Americans felt that we needed to have a different kind of president, right? We needed to have somebody who wasn't part of the establishment. You remember all of that,
they wanted to go outside of Washington.
That's
they
right.
wanted to,
That's right. They're inside the Beltway, and they have this mentality, and they're ignoring us, you know. And I think part of what
and then they thought they needed, instead of a leader, they needed a CEO. I mean, that's really what they thought, but maybe you need a combination of the two. But
and I think there was also trying to explain Donald Trump's appeal, I suppose, which I think is what we're driving at, is the sense that there's a part of American public that feels they're being heard, right? That feels like this man is paying attention to us, and I feel like maybe there's a little bit of FDR-ishness in there, right? Because again, he was very careful to sort of say, I hear you, and when I go to Washington, I'm going to take your interests.
I'm going to clean the swamp. I'm going to, But the other thing that I think is really interesting that people also, you know, as a history professor, you also have to sort of look at the context in which we're living, but also how did we get here? And so one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is this idea that the New Deal gave way to what a lot of people thought in the 70s was the Raw Deal, which was this idea of the war that was executed, you know, of the Confederacy of big business and CEOs and the super rich and the right-wing zealots, and really how the pulse and norms that made America's middle class possible after the war started to eradicate then in the 70s, and then we just saw the rapid decline, or you know, all the that the economic progress we made. Then it became greed is good, and then we diminished the strength of unions and the appeal of workers, and then this and then we also weaponized nostalgia, like about, you know, our suburbs. And so how do you think? How did we get, you know, from the New Deal to sort of what all this that happened in the 70s, which really set us on the trajectory of how we got here today? So you really have to look back. But what do you think it was that during that time period from the New Deal to the 70s that caused, I mean, was that really the 60s and anti-war and youth? And what do you think it is?
Yeah, I think this is you're kind of hinting at a lot of the things that I think I would throw into that explanation. I think the civil rights movement, and which was very divisive, and then the anti-war movement, very divisive, the development of the counterculture, right, and toward the end of the 60s and early 70s. I think there was this kind of reaction to those movements on the part of, if you call it like middle America, or the silent majority. Nixon would call it the silent majority. And they really felt like they needed a different kind of leadership, because the country, in their way of thinking, was coming apart under these Democrats, right? And the Democrats kept, if you think about LBJ's Great Society programs, it was thought that what the Democrats were doing is just like throwing, you know, tax money and federal programs at these problems, and not really trying to deal with the underlying issues. And I think, again, this is where you get the conservative movement of the 70s and 80s. They felt that the problem was really not a problem that government could fix. This was really about values, right? So you get these values voters, right? What we needed to do is to sort of send leaders to Washington who would speak a different kind of language, right? What we really need is, you said weaponizing nostalgia. We need to return back to sort of this Christian roots, right? You think of the moral majority, right? Or, return to kind of values of hard work and thrift and reward those things because those hippies are, just laying around and not doing anything, and these activists just want a handout, right? So it was easy to sort of cartoonish, I guess, or to create this kind of cartoon of what the left represented through the 1950s and 60s and early 70s.
And then the 70s to really now, it became all about big business. And even you see, even today, the disconnect between what's going on Wall Street to what's going on Main Street. I mean, there's no connection, but it's all about, the big business and the wealthy. And so, but also, I mean, what do you think about, do you think that there has been a dilution to the office of the president and, the importance of the leadership that FDR gave and those kinds of things for a presidency? Do you think that for the office, do you think that that's still relevant or important?
Well, I think the presidency is still important. And I think that you're asking, I think, something to the effect of, has there been any weakening of presidential authority in relation to some of these other...
And also the respect that the office of the U.S. president gets on the world stage. I mean, when FDR, he commanded, a presence. And, I'm just wondering, how is that office viewed, and do you think that we can recover?
Yeah, I would say that I don't feel like there was any sort of weakening in how other cultures and other nations perceive the American presidency up until Trump. I think he's, for the reasons that he would say, we needed to kind of get rid of these trade deals, and we need to pull out of these agreements like the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. We need to kind of put America first. That sounds one way. It sounds, Well,
that was also the period of isolationism,
yeah,
right?
It sounds kind of good, maybe in Middle America to hear that, but it doesn't sound the same if you're in Europe or if you're in the Far East, hearing the president say that. So I think there's been some diminution of the prestige of the presidency as a result of that.
Well, I think that this idea of how it's perceived, on a world stage, I think it also brings up this issue of how we teach U.S. history and some of the issues that are going on. But also, like they say that when you look at a map that's made in the United States is huge and Africa is sort of down here small. But in reality, Africa as a continent is much bigger than the United States. And when you go to Europe and you see maps, it's very different. So do you think that that's part of us trying to not rewrite, but sort of influence our belief in our history and our importance as a country?
Yeah, I think there's a long history of what's known as American exceptionalism. There's this belief that, this goes all the way back to the Puritans, that the group of people that came over here were chosen by God and they had this special mission to carry out. And I think you can see this get kind of secularized in the Revolutionary and Founding era. That we're going to create the asylum of mankind, according to Thomas Paine. And that people really thought of this as a kind of unique experiment in self-government, this kind of exceptional place. And this carries all the way through the 19th century.
Right.
Abraham Lincoln believed in it, right? And we were going to preserve the last best hope of all mankind through fighting this war and defeating the Confederacy and slavery. And I think all these early 20th century presidents, you started with Wilson, right? Wilson had this kind of view that, everything's gone sideways. America's got to kind of wake up and come in and save, Teddy Roosevelt thought that way. And I think FDR is a sort of avatar of that kind of kind of idea of American exceptionalism.
Right. And I think he went back to tapping into that emotion.
Yeah.
And that sort of, and bringing back that pride, in the individual and what we can do as, a society of individuals.
And I think this partly explains maybe the current state of the country, because if you go back to the Obama presidency, there was this attempt to sort of be a good player, like we're going to join these countries and we're going to work together to solve climate change. We're going to, work together to sort of address these problems with other nations. And there was a feeling, I think, among some part of the American population that, well, we're sort of giving away this idea, or we're sort of giving up on this idea that America is the leader, and America is an exceptional power, right? And these other countries are sort of.
Well, I think that Obama was sort of what I would call a great collaborator. He also was very, he was a professor, and he was very he wanted to get a lot of opinions and do a lot of research and talk to a lot of people before he would really make a decision. And he was very thoughtful in that. So, but he did believe in the collaboration and sort of working together only, makes us stronger as a society of the world, and he looked at that it was a global society. But when you look at now about, and I'm sure you think about this, about how we teach U.S. history, especially now with sort of this reckoning, I guess, we're having with our past and the Confederacy, and how all of these like it's almost that we want to erase this period, and sort of like even to the extreme when you for watching Gone with the Wind, they put a disclaimer at the front of it. I mean, what do you think about that as a historian and also as a teacher of history?
I mean, it's very, very interesting, and I would make a distinction between like history and heritage. And so history is everything. It's all the successes, the failures, the blemishes, the warts and all, right? You can't do history without talking about Native Americans and how they were removed in slavery, and Tulsa, thinking about kind of recent race relations issues. Right. Heritage is the part of history that a nation wants to celebrate. Like, so we're going to select from this historical record some things to really commemorate. We're going to build statues to these particular people. We're going to create a museum devoted to, telling the story of World War II, for example, the great success, when the U.S. led the Allied coalition. So I'm very comfortable in the world of history because it's messy. You sort of argue about it. How do you weight these things? Is it more important to talk about slavery? The 1619 Project is doing this, right? We really want to kind of foreground this as the foundation of our country. No, we don't want to do that. So there's this give and take, right? Now, heritage is the Confederate monument, and what we do in the public square, and how we celebrate things in a kind of an official capacity as a government which represents all the people. And I think that's equally contested. Those monuments come up, they go down, and could we be more circumspect? Maybe those monuments should stay up as I'm thinking of Confederate monuments in particular. Those things went up in the 1920s, right? And they're really more about Jim Crow and segregation and maintaining white supremacy than they are about the Confederacy as such. Right. So then you have to think, what's the value to us as a community of maintaining the Robert E. Lee statue, given the fact that it was put up by a bunch of white supremacists who were trying to intimidate, black activists who were seeking their civil rights? I think
that at this point, they say history is always viewed in the rearview mirror. So the idea is that maybe we leave it, but we add like a plaque or something that gives you the context. Because what I fear with a lot of things is that we don't look at them in the time of the context in which they happened. And my dad's a doctor, and he always says when you make a decision, it's not the right decision, the wrong decision, good or bad. You make a decision based on the information that you have at the time you need to make the decision. And so it's putting it in a context, and I think that we've sort of lost that, and just trying to say, okay, we need to take all these down. And now, but even like going as far as saying, now we got to take down Christopher Columbus, and we have to take down
Frederick Douglass.
Right. I mean, and and even worrying about Thomas Jefferson, one of the founders, who was really against, was one of the founders of the country and really created a lot. Yes, but he also owned slaves. So we can own it, but I don't think you need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, I think that partly these people are human too. So I just worry that and that's partly like with the 1619 Project, and then what President Trump has now created, which is the 1776 coalition to look at, because he thinks that how we're teaching U.S. history now, or our See, I think you're right, because I think he's not really talking about how we teach U.S. history. He's really talking about how we teach U.S. heritage, because he was saying that we were then diminishing all the things that are great about America, and
Well, the existing curriculum is teaching people to hate America, which I don't think I do that in my classes.
Right.
This history's complex. There's a lot of things in here, and you take the good with the bad when you look at things honestly and truthfully. It's a record of human achievement and human suffering and tragedy along, those two stories go alongside each other. But I think what you're describing, where you take the monument and you put some other things in there is a kind of layering, which I find really appealing, because then you're allowing the person to come in and see the story unfold. Well, here's a group of people that celebrated the Confederacy starting in the 20s. Why would they do that? Well, then here's a group of people in the year 2020 who have an issue with that, and they want us to kind of think about what the community is celebrating by putting this guy up on a pedestal in the middle of the town square or in the traffic circle that everybody has to drive around. And to me, that's more interesting intellectually, because it more mimics what history does, which is layers.
Right, I think it's layers, because I think also, like, for people to think that the democracy is a given, and that it's going to be here. It's not. And if you look at, history, I mean, even to think that, people don't realize that Adolf Hitler was democratically elected chancellor. There wasn't like a coup or
everything
military.
he did in Germany was legal.
Right, and then what he did when he got into office, and that's where So when people think that we're always going to have a democratic society, and I think that it's important to have these things to understand. No, there are times even in our history where there was this fraction that we may not have had a democracy, which I think is really important to look at today, because we are going more to this autocratic and sort of what he would like to be an oligarchy kind of society. So I do think that that's important.
Well, you could like, if you were living history forward as opposed to looking back, if you were sitting in like the 1890s and you were looking forward, like you could have some real questions about whether this system is going to survive, right? The populists were saying things about these, greedy capitalists that were wrecking the country. If you looked at the country in 1932 or 1933 looking forward, you were like, I don't know if this is going to survive. I mean, you could really have grave questions about whether this country can survive it, or maybe 68 or something. You think of the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. The country's coming apart, and we're burning the cities. Do we really have a future as a country? I think that's a really important exercise in kind of just civic, improvement and civic awareness.
And I think also that with this whole idea of the 1619 project versus it's the 1776 commission, and this idea of how we teach and indoctrinate students into our history. But American history is one of the only other classes besides English and math that's mandatory. And when I was in school, really why it was mandatory was because it was designed to teach a two-party electoral system. I mean, that's how you learned American history and how that developed. So I sort of feel like, weren't we indoctrinated at that point as well into thinking about, the party system? And
so is your question like,
has history gotten too political?
We kind of like normalized the two-party system, and then suddenly the Greens and Libertarians are like, what about us?
But do you think that in some ways we've politicized history?
It's possible, because we've had the, when you say we're going to have a history of the nation state of the United States, you've politicized it, right?
Right, okay.
Because you could tell a different story about like North America. I'm kind of interested in environmental history. You could tell the whole story of this landscape without really making too much of a reference to the, kind of the politics and so forth like that. It wouldn't necessarily be a particularly great history, but there's ways of sort of flipping it around so that the focal point is not the nation state, but that's what we want our schools to do, right? Is to teach the history of the nation state.
Because we want them to be good citizens, to be able to understand and vote. That's what we want. And that's really, and so I mean, I think, and I think that you have to teach it from history, all different sides, right? You have to bring in a lot of different.
So this is a little bit arcane, but there's the these movements among historians to sort of rethink how history is written. So we have these like new left historians and social historians in the 1960s that wanted to get away from telling the story of the nation state, and they wanted to focus on social class, like the working class, the history of the working class. Like there's this whole other thing going on that's outside of politics, these people organizing and having experience. And feminists and so forth have had their contribution to the way history is sort of written. And each of these, I kind of like to use the analogy of a movie director, kind of looking at a scene, and he's got like two actors that are involved in dialogue. Well, you could shoot that from one angle with one camera, and that would probably be okay, right? But if you start positioning more cameras around that, and you want to look at the dialogue coming from this actor and then the dialogue from that actor, maybe you want a kind of an overhead view, maybe from outside the cafe and through the window, you end up with, I think, a much richer portrait, right? Or a much richer scene and probably more satisfying for the audience. And I think that the best kind of history is one that does hold all these different perspectives, in play and trying to tell the story from more than just one.
Right, and like I thought what was interesting is now you're sort of working on energy in American history and the role that the political, social, and environmental, and you're creating like an encyclopedia, I guess. I mean, that's another way to look at it, because that really is a very big part of our country's history.
Well, and this is a kind of a new way of thinking about things that have happened in the United States without really focusing hard on presidential elections and administrations, right? So,
although you are going to have to look at them from
no question about it. It's a huge political, but so there's these phases of development where you have like the wind and animal power, and then you have like this era of industrialization, which is fueled by fossil fuels, and now we're moving into renewables, and so you can kind of talk about a different periodization scheme. And I was actually fascinated by one of the contributors. And I got involved in a discussion, and she said, I want to kind of write about petrocultures, which are societies that are created and they have their particular kind of set of dynamics because they're energized by fossil fuels as opposed to other sources. I'm like, well, that's really interesting. So that's a kind of new way of thinking about the United States, that the United States is sort of a petroculture, right? We have a highway system and automobiles, and
cities were built around the cars.
We have houses in the desert where there shouldn't be houses because of air conditioning, and that's because of fossil fuels, right? Well, increasingly more renewables, but you get the idea. Our movies, our songs are about our cars, and so I like that there's this way of thinking about the American past that can get you outside of this narrow channel of just focusing on presidential administrations or kind of the political narrative, the two-party system. As important as those things are, I think you can also get some insight into who we are as Americans and what's happening in our country by looking at these other angles, where we're a petroculture. Let's talk about that for a minute.
Or if we're youth culture, or you can look at different kinds of things. So are you hopeful as a historian, or are you? How do you think we're doing here?
You mean as a nation?
As a nation, and looking at where we are and where we're potentially going. I mean, I sort of sometimes wonder. I don't know if I think we can. Again, people who said we don't know about this democracy, if we can recover. I don't know if we can recover. I mean, but from where you sit as a historian and sort of taking it and looking at it from different points of view and understanding certain things, do you think that you're hopeful?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of inertia. These institutions have inertia. There are, forces at work to sort of propel, the established order, the status quo forward, and I do think that as nervous as a lot of us are as Americans of what's happening, people on the left are concerned about sort of authoritarian, proto-fascist sort of indications coming from the right, and the right's very worried about, Portland coming apart, and
people protesting and
violence breaking out. That's right, and the disrespect that they think is being hurled at the president. So, I guess as a historian, I go back to the 1860s. We actually really fought an actual war, between the states, and there were, 600, 700,000 killed in action, and more civilians died, and as painful as that was, there was a recovery process, and the sort of system rebalanced itself and found its footing again, and we started electing presidents again, and the Supreme Court made decisions again, and I'm not minimizing that. I'm not minimizing the.
But you also feel, from looking back, you can feel good about looking forward too.
I think so. I think so. There's some lessons from the past that help me, allay my own anxieties about living in the present. And I have children, and I really feel like we're leaving a healthy country, a healthy economy, healthy communities to my own children and my grandchildren. So.
Okay. So at the end of each And Good Company program, I ask guests the same 12 questions that French novelist Marcel Proust popularized from a Victorian parlor game. And Proust believed that by answering these questions, you're going to reveal a little bit about your true nature. So what is your favorite word?
My favorite word? Wow, that changes all the time. I've started to say brilliant a lot because I have a colleague in my department who's from England, and he says brilliant a lot, and I think it's amazing. It could be a compliment, it could be a statement of joy and pleasure over seeing something. So I've been saying that a lot. I put that in some of my students' comments to papers. It's brilliant.
Yeah. What is your least favorite word?
Oh, probably something really gross, like vomit or something. I don't know.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
I like music. I listen to music a lot, and I play guitar a lot, and that kind of does a lot for me in terms of nourishing me and distracting me from the stress. So.
What turns you off creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Maybe I'll take. Oh boy. I'm not allowed to pass on any of these, I'm guessing.
No, you're not.
Probably arrogance and the kind of
like hubris.
Yeah, the sort of intellectual certitude, or sort of people that
entitlement.
Try to bowl you over there, okay, so.
And what sound or noise do you love? So that be.
I do a lot of hiking, and honestly, I really love taking hikes along creeks and brooks where there's a sound of
running water.
Yeah, running water. So.
What sound or noise do you hate?
I would say probably. I'm raising a puppy now, and that thing barks from time to time, and it's really starting to get on my kind of last nerve. So I wouldn't say dog barking is the worst thing, but I'm just thinking about it right now because.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
I think it would be really interesting to. I have never really thought about this because I just really enjoy what I'm doing so much of it. If I had to do something else, what would that be? I think it would be interesting to go into the law. I teach intro to law, and I find what lawyers do, I'm sure they would tell me it's not as romantic or as interesting as I make it out to be. I think what they do is fascinating, and especially the ones that are working in areas where they're serving underserved population, like immigration law, or maybe.
Or probably the Supreme Court, who's interpreting a document, and all the time. So
it's very interesting work.
Because that would also apply to history. What profession would you not like to do?
I guess I would say I'm not really naturally a kind of risk taker, so I'm thinking of the jobs that would require me to kind of put myself out on some kind of risky thing. I do watch those, the Alaska crab shows, and I'm like, well, I wouldn't want to be on that.
What do you consider your greatest achievement?
Probably, I would say my family. My wife and my two boys are just amazing, and that's something I really treasure and value. It's important to me. Who,
living or dead, would you most like to have a conversation with?
Honestly, I would love to have a conversation with Jesus. I think so much of my faith is sort of based on that, and also history is sort of like really steered in that direction, and so much is said on his behalf by current people who espouse. Right. So you want to get from the source. Yeah, it would be interesting to sort of have that conversation, I think. How would you like to die? I don't really want to go out in a blaze of glory. I think dying in my sleep would be probably the best.
And if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
Welcome. There are many people here waiting to see you.
Ah. Well, I want to thank Dr. Webb for giving us a chance to have a conversation about thinking about our past and for our future. So I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much.
It was a real delight. Thank you.
And I want to thank Dr. Webb for sitting at the table and giving us a chance to look at our past in a way to think about our future. So thank you very much.
It was a real pleasure.
Thank you. Please join me again next time when you can again enjoy a seat at the table for great conversation and good company.